Okay, apparently it's working. I didn't get through all my animations in this, but let's talk about truth and reconciliation, a concept that comes to us from South Africa, where Nelson Mandela stopped a culture from destroying itself, stopped a country from destroying itself when he came out of prison and started this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we had this, we borrowed this idea. Last year, how many of you went to a Native Canadian Truth and Reconciliation meeting last year? Because we had them in almost every community in the country, every major community in the country. Nobody? Nobody went to Truth and Reconciliation? No. Because we have this big push sometimes, but we're just unaware, most of us, of the history and the current devastation of Native Canadian culture in Canada. So there was this big push by the government to say, we need to acknowledge the sins we did. Just like in South Africa, where the white community had to acknowledge the terrible treatment of blacks over years and years, we said in Canada, that's a good idea. Because few people understand how badly the Native people in Canada were treated. We should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And for a whole year they did it. And nobody really noticed it. Okay? Because we think of ourselves as settlers, not as invaders, as Ellis Walker told us. I just mentioned that in Germany, they do an excellent job in their schools trying to make sure their students understand the Holocaust. It is interesting to me that in Germany you have the largest anti-racist demonstrations in the world, in the country that has the history of the Holocaust. May that be true of Canada if we would learn and acknowledge the way we've treated Native Canadian people. Hopefully you'll watch this film when you're in Mexico called Freedom Riders. Maybe you will. Okay, so let's talk about residential schools, Native residential schools in Canada. This is about, the residential schools existed because we wanted to get rid of Native culture. How do you get rid of Native culture? You stop them speaking their language. That's the first and most important thing to do. And so we didn't really do this. From my reading of the history, we didn't really do this because it was a movement of compassion for the difficult circumstances. It was a dislike of Native culture. It was an unwillingness to appreciate, to absorb it, to walk a mile in a Native person's moccasins. We always considered them primitive cultures. Remember that Cheryl Bear said, never use that word when you talk to Native people. Never say, yours was a primitive culture. They had very vibrant, artistic, political cultures. In fact, a lot of people would say that our current federal democratic political system is shaped upon the system of the Mohawk and I'm forgetting the name of the tribe, of the tribes out in the east, that we looked at their federation of tribes and the way they ruled and modeled a lot of the federal politics upon it. We also know that they had incredibly democratic systems where where women could rise to the level of chief and have incredible authority in a tribe. And yet, there was a lack of appreciation for these cultures and a lack of an effort to understand the good things in them. I just keep thinking of Josh Wong's statement. How should Christians approach other cultures? We should assimilate ourselves to them. That's what the Bible teaches. To the Jews, you become a Jew, and to the pagans, you become a pagan, and to those without the law, you become as one without the law. I became all things to all men, so that by all means I might save some. You know, that's what Barnabas did, and I'll come back to Barnabas when we talk about our biblical view of culture, but he went to non-Jewish cultures, and he went, wow, seems like the Holy Spirit is here. He somehow was able to look with spiritual eyes, not at the physical, not at the differences, and say, there are things in this culture that are good. The God is already here. They don't need to adopt our culture before they adopt the gospel. And we've gone around the world, I say we, people of British and European origin, have gone around the world saying that if you become Christian, you must become Western. And it's been a wrong message for a long, long time. There's things in India, Indian culture, Chinese culture, all over the world culture that are far more Christian, naturally speaking, than in Western culture. It's a very greedy culture. Okay, so this is policy. I'm not giving you a representation of native or residential schools as, saying that, records of abuse and all these other things. What I want to look at is the historical and legal process. Why and how the government went about putting children into residential schools. So in order to educate them properly, we must separate them from their families. Otherwise, those British, otherwise they will learn that culture. They keep learning the language and the culture and the traditions and the customs of native people, and we've got to cut them off from that. That's the way to civilize them. What does it mean to be civilized? Think of, I don't know, there's lots of things we could think of, but think of General Custer and his cavalry riding through a native village early in the morning before anyone was awake and murdering men, women, and children. Civilize them, okay? That was Hector Langevin, a public works minister. In other words, a member of the cabinet in 1883. Okay, separate them from their families and civilize them. As we said before, kill the Indian in the child and thereby save the child. A lot of my stuff, I just want to acknowledge, I took from a report called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that came out last year, available online, and you're encouraged to use it and spread it, and so that's what I'm stealing some of my ideas from them. They made us many promises, more than I can remember, said Red Cloud. They promised, but they only kept one. They promised to take our land, and they took it. Sitting Bull, I told you just a little bit of, I'm fascinated by the story of Sitting Bull. I used to teach it in Socials 10. When Custer attacked the Sioux Indians, Sitting Bull fought back and is in fact the only commander who's ever defeated the United States Army. That's interesting. That's an interesting stat. They chased him into Canada, where he came for refuge among other Sioux people in Canada, Northern Sioux, Blackfoot, which were of a similar band, and the Canadian Northwest Mounted Police kicked him out. It was actually a guy named Captain James Walsh, head of the detachment Southern Saskatchewan, that kicked him back into the United States, where he was arrested and eventually killed in captivity. One of his compatriots, Red Cloud, a Canadian Sioux named Wanduta. I just got a photo of him here because we're going to come back to him. He's the guy who refused to stop wearing his native dress and was constantly jailed for it. Refused to stop having potlatch festivals and was jailed for it. We'll come back and talk about him. So the goal of residential schools was assimilation through isolation. Okay? Separate them from their families so that they will not adopt that culture. The Archbishop of St. Boniface wrote in 1912 of the need to place Aboriginal children in residential schools at the age of 6, since they had to be, quote, caught young to be saved from what is on the whole the degenerating influence of their home environment. So, this is not us. This is not a modern view. I realize that, the past is a different country. We are not the past. We don't operate the same way. And yet this history of racism I'm suggesting carries on into that woman last week who couldn't get treated for a broken hip in a Canadian hospital, probably from what they investigated because of racism. In some communities, children were forcibly removed. In other words, early on, it was presented as a way to get your children an advantage by giving them modern education. And I'm all in favor of education. That's why I'm making you sit down and shut up and listen to everything I say and all the rest of that. But, you got to want to be here, right? You got to want the education or it's useless to you. Is that not right? Have you ever heard me say that? If you don't want to be here, then you shouldn't. You should make an authentic choice and go elsewhere. Don't get up right now, though, because I'm recording. But seriously, I do believe that, and I have often encouraged students to do so. So some children, however, they began to actually round up and forcibly take them away from parents who resisted. And the resistance to residential schools increased over time because parents began to realize the negative effects of these residential schools on their children. And at school, of course, you were banned from using your language. Okay, you were beaten. You were beaten and slapped and isolated and put into confinement if you tried to speak your native language. Because it is a bad language, and you must unlearn it and everything that goes with it, including the beliefs and the values and the rituals. The goal, as this ironic sign shows, was to remove the Indian and save the child, but I would suggest that we lost both to some extent in the process. Here's Thomas More. I showed you a picture of him, 1896. A year later, he's been in the Regina Indian Industrial School, they were called in the early days, and he looks like this. He's fixed. He's civilized. He's Canadian, British actually, and so we no longer have to, just because Canadian identity in that period was far more British. We considered ourselves defenders of the empire and all the rest. I don't know. I just, clearly they're both staged pictures, and yet it's a powerful symbol of what we were attempting to do, to say Indian culture bad, British culture good. You must become like us. Look at all these men, women, and children in this place. They've got their not just Western clothes, but religious clothes. Because the schools were run by the Catholic, the United, the Methodists, and the Anglicans, Protestant and Catholic groups, they not only imposed cultural values, they imposed religion. It's one of the reasons that I say a Christian school can make a hellion out of you. Because if they just fill your head with religious ideas and you never get a chance to put it into practice, or you don't believe it in the first place, I mean, now you're just becoming a smarter and smarter sinner. These people were forced into these schools. They weren't doing this by choice in most cases, or in many cases, put it that way. Not in all cases. Some people generally wanted to go to the schools. Some people were of that faith, but many were not. So this is from the annual report of the Department of Indian Affairs for the year ending December 31st, 1885. I got 15 minutes left. And he said this: I feel certain that this school will be a great success, that it will be the chief means of civilizing the Indian. But to obtain this result, accommodation must be made to take in more pupils, as we can now only take in one from each reserve. A school for Indian girls would be of great importance, and I may say would be absolutely necessary to effect civilization of the next generation of Indians. If the women were educated, it would almost guarantee that their children would be educated. Now notice, you gotta read between the lines here. It's not that they're being given something, it's what's being taken that is more important to this speaker. It's what's being taken from them that he's interested in, and that's the culture. With no danger of their, guarantee that the children would also be educated and also brought up as Christians, with no danger of their following the awful existence that many of them now ignorantly live. It will be nearly futile to educate the boys and leave the girls uneducated, because they're the carriers of culture. They speak to the baby. They teach that language. Don't you love this picture? Look, holding the native babies that are going to be adopted out oftentimes I have a full family of adopted Cree Indians who are my cousins. They were scooped up in what we call the 60s scoop, which was the last effort of the government to make a major effort to take children away from their parents. But look at that. I don't know if you can see it very clearly, but look at the anger in this man's eyes. If you can see this photo closely, he's not happy. This is not a happy family about giving up their children to be raised as Christians or in a Western way. We said all these cultural practices, these look like Haida people down here, this looks like Inuit up here. I think this is a photo from out east. All these cultures were going to be lost. So we opened 130 of these schools between 1831 and 1996. There was an attempt very early to start a residential school, but it failed because the Native culture was very strong in 1620, and most Native people didn't want to leave their tribes or their culture or their families. By 1848, there were approximately 10,000 Aboriginal students in residential schools, representing about half the student age population at that time. A small minority attended local schools if they lived in those areas, if they lived near cities, etc. Today, there are more than 80,000. This is last year's stat. 80,000 Aboriginal people alive who attended Aboriginal schools. I'm doing a memoir class in my English 10 at the college, and there's a guy there writing about his residential school experience, and they are not happy little paragraphs that he keeps turning in. So the schools were all over Canada, okay? It was not only to try to get as many of the Native people, but from as many of the different cultures as possible. And so they were spread all across Canada. The agents, as I mentioned, were the churches. Sorry, I got one of those wrong. I said United, but it was Presbyterian. Oh, later they joined with the Methodists, become the United, that's why. So that's like the double imposition upon these people, not only of Western culture, but of religious culture. Forced to memorize the Bible, forced to pray, to say your prayers daily. I think that's a very damaging thing in terms of religion. So in terms of the time, you got to kind of understand the time that this was occurring is a different time, right? And at that time, there was a real lack of cultural sensitivity. The British really believed they were God's agents to civilize the known world, to take the savage cultures out. We'll talk about white man's burden in a moment. There was also a good goal. I'm actually very much in favor of the goal of universal education. I'm in favor of the idea of putting every Canadian into a good school and giving them good opportunities. However, you can't do it without cultural sensitivity. And there was also, by 1870 and 1885, some serious rebellions in Canada by Native people. And the idea was, if you take the children away, if the children are held hostage, you can expect greater compliance of these people on the plains. Because you got to remember what we're trying to do. Louis Riel rebelled because the government took away the rights that he said he had to hunt buffalo. That is their culture. He was Métis, but the native tribes of which he was a part hunted buffalo for their livelihood. Everything revolved around the buffalo. We're going to watch Dances with Wolves with Sioux Indians, and it's very similar. When you take away the buffalo, you take away the culture. And so but the government, think about what happens. If you're trying to put railways in, and farm plots, and cities, and roads, and then great massive herds of buffalo come running through every few months, it's not good for your civilization. There's real conflict there. And so the government was just determined to have these Native people settle. And residential schools were part of that process. Talking about the lack of cultural sensitivity, this is very much the attitude of many British people, British Canadians as well, at the time, that they had a burden as a white man to give civilization to the darkened peoples, the wild peoples, the sullen peoples that were half devil and half child. The idea was you were to go and serve so that these wild savages could come to the light. And, you know, on the one hand, it's nice by Rudyard Kipling that you're going to serve others, but if the goal is only conquest and defeat of their culture, then that is not necessary. That is clearly not a biblical way of approaching it. And notice the way other cultures are talked about, that after you've filled the mouth of famine and stopped the sicknesses and done all these things for the others, their heathen folly will destroy it all. Okay? That's kind of the attitude we had in the early part of the century. Very arrogant, very elitist, very non-Christian. So as I mentioned, Indian Affairs School Inspector James McCrae said in 1886, 1 year after the Second Riel Rebellion, that it is unlikely that any tribe or tribes would give trouble of a serious nature to a government whose members had children completely under the government control. So the residential schools, which started right at this time, were being used as an agent. If you go back in the history of Aboriginal Canadian relations, it started very differently. Of course, like we saw with Columbus, there were Columbus said, treat the native people well. We need their food, right? In the early part of conquest, before the conquest, with contact, you had much more equal relations. And so there was a lot of promises made, a lot of cooperation between certain native groups and the European governments. The French tended to make allies out of the Huron, and the English tended to make allies out of the Mohawk. And so you had this conflict between tribes based upon their alliances with Europeans. There was negotiations, there was alliances, there were treaties. All this could be summarized in the Royal Proclamation of 1763, when the French were finally defeated. Look at the territory that was called Indian Territory. Now, it didn't necessarily mean that it was in title Indian, as in land title Indian. But the government realized that they owed a huge debt to the native tribes with whom they were in alliance. And they said, after you help us win this war against the French, we're going to give you full access to your lands, you're going to have full control in these areas. And it worked. In fact, in 1774, that land, extension of land right down into the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River, that became law in the Quebec Act, 1774. But these colonies over here, these British colonies who had become Americans, they didn't like that, because that's the reason they fought the French. To give you a quick history lesson, they fought to get access to that land. Then the British government, to appease the Indians who were their allies, gave it back to the Aboriginal people. And so the Americans in 1775, 1 year after the Quebec Act, started shooting. Okay, and we had the American Revolution. But listen what it says in the Royal Proclamation. And we do further declare to be our royal will and pleasure for the present aforesaid, to reserve under our sovereignty, protection, and dominion for the use of the said Indians all the lands and territories not included within the limits of our said 3 new governments, or within the limits of the territory granted by the Hudson's Bay Company, and also all lands and territories lying westward of the sources of the rivers which fall into the sea from the west and the northwest, as said before. So it was a massive pile of land that was supposed to be given to the native people, and we put it in writing. Maybe a mistake. Because now that's coming back to haunt us with certain land claims that were signed just in June of last year. So the process, we're talking about the legal and political process here of the residential schools. In the early days, there was a lot of native leaders in the 1780s, early 1800s, who were also interested in making sure there was education for Native children. It's not a bad thing to want to educate the Native children, but they wanted to do it as teaching wigwams. In other words, they wanted to keep their cultural values even as they helped the children adapt to the changes that were clear and obvious in Canadian society by this time. I already mentioned Louis' rebellions of 1870 and the challenge that this gave to the government about settlers. I don't remember exactly what it is I want to say about the page. Let me move on. Okay, so we went from mutual cooperation in the early days to imperial control. The Bagot Commission of 1847 concludes that the separation of children from their parents is essential for assimilation. The goal, stated by the government many, many times over, was assimilation. We see that word as a bad word. In fact, it is. If you're trying to control another group by assimilating them, that's wrong. If you're trying to assimilate yourself into another culture in order to learn from them, that's different. By 1857, we had the Gradual Civilization Act, okay, which said that all men over 21 who can read and write in English or French and receive an elementary education may become British citizens. That's nice. Without the right to vote, of course. They didn't get that till 1960. But for the privilege of becoming British subjects, they would have to forego their Indian status. So we were saying to them, yeah, you can be British without the right to vote, but you can be British. You just have to give up your Indian status. The idea was we didn't want Native people as an opposition to our government. Essentially, assimilation asked Native people to trade Indigenous identity for political equality. By 1872, the Dominion Lands Act gave free land to European settlers and putting roads and railways right through already negotiated reserves. In 1876, we have the famous Indian Act, which became the foundation of much of future Native policy in Canada. And we had, who is this guy? I don't have his name. But this comes from the Department of the Interior. And it states, I am firmly persuaded that the true interests of Aborigines, which we actually call them in Australia, we don't really use that word in Canada anymore, and of the state alike, require that every effort should be made to aid the red man in lifting himself out of his condition of tutelage and dependence, and that is clearly our wisdom and our duty through education by every other means. So, you know, the idea here is not necessarily bad. Giving education to people so that they can adapt to the changes in society. But we're going to look at the way this actually... I get all nervous again. Okay, so this report that came out just a few years after the Indian Act, called the Davin Report, was based upon sending one of Canada's politicians to the south to look at the residential schools that were already being used in the United States. Very similar kind of picture to what we looked at with Thomas More, right? You see this Cherokee family here, looking, you know, poor and impoverished and shabby, and them looking all cleaned up. This was the idea of a residential school, that you were going to allow these people to participate in Native culture, in American culture. Dr. Charles Eastman, who actually worked with the government to promote residential schools for a while in the United States, he looks very much like he has assimilated to Western culture, and so does this woman named Zitalasa. She played violin, she played in an orchestra, she was very well read and very well educated, and this is the goal, right? But what we actually found with both of these people was that later in life they rejected the assimilation that they felt was being forced upon them. And both Dr. Charles Eastman and Zitkalasa went back to their native roots and started promoting native culture. So this is what the Davin report missed. It came back with this idea of this is how you assimilate the people. Residential schooling. Look at these examples of this doctor and this musician. But in fact, both of these people eventually would reject the culture that was imposed upon them and return to their roots. There's something strong about that. There's something strong about this idea of who am I? What are my roots? Have you ever seen that Ancestry Roadshow that's on PBS sometimes? People longing to know, where am I from? I remember I did a lot of that in my 20s, where I went back and researched our Irish roots. That was the only ones I could really trace, all the way back to the McGowans of Cork County, Ireland. And there was something about an identity there, a feeling like now I have an identity. But that's going back generations and generations. I'm not really Irish. And in fact, the name McGowan is just Gaelic for worker, and the name Smith is just English for worker. So we used to be McGowans, but we became Smiths, so anglicized, lost that culture somewhere along the way. In 1880, there were 11 residential schools operating in Canada. They were called industrial schools in the West. And, you have people saying things like this. This comes from the annual report on the Department of Indian Affairs. These will be the future mothers, and it is most important that we have them properly trained and educated, meaning assimilated, meaning that they will no longer be promoting and passing on native culture. In 1884, we banned the potlatch and other native redistribution ceremonies. Listen to this quote by a member of Parliament in 1914. This is an actual quote from the parliamentary transcripts. "Ownership and selfishness, which is foreign to the mind of the Indian in his normal condition, is really the foundation of civilization." Think about that. Ownership and selfishness is the foundation of civilization. And because native people don't respect ownership and selfishness, we must train them to do that. There is a sense of inevitability. When you look back on the history of Canada and the westward expansion of Canadian and American society, you're thinking, well, what else could have, should have happened with native people? It's inevitable that they're going to be absorbed into the dominant culture. And yeah, on a economic level, I suppose that's true. But I think as Christians, we should be looking at that and saying, okay, what is it in native culture that we should be endorsing, preserving, fighting for, rather than just saying, well, it's inevitable, you're going to lose your language, you're going to lose your culture. Because if our government is behaving in a way that's non-Christian, it's your duty as a Christian to oppose it. It's your patriotic duty, or your Christian duty, to oppose your government. I find this very ironic. Maybe this is Halloween, I'm not sure. But the nuns are dressing them up in little native headbands that they're making at school. Kind of ironic. In 1905, the government could move reserves if they were located too close to large towns. So despite having negotiated treaties and reserves, if the reserves ended up being in territories that the government wanted to use, they simply passed a law saying we're allowed to move those reserves. In 1906, there was the amendment to say, because there's resistance, because families were resisting putting their kids into residential schools, the government said they amended the act so that they could forcibly remove children and put them in the schools. A guy named Peter Bryce, in a report in 1907, said there's dangerous conditions. Now, I don't know if we'll look at some population graphs later that show the decline of the population of not only North American Indians, but Aztec groups and groups in the south as well. And it's largely because of diseases that they weren't able to combat. Okay, part of that is violence and warfare, but mostly there's a huge decrease in native population because they had fewer immunities to Western diseases. And so when you started grouping these populations from reserves into residential schools, they began to pass around communicable diseases like tuberculosis. And in some places, there was a 35 to 65% mortality rate. Oftentimes, these residential schools have large graveyards outside them, despite the fact that the kids weren't supposed to stay there permanently. He said in his report, there is inadequate government funding, poorly constructed schools, sanitary and ventilation problems, inadequate diet, etc. D.C. Scott, who was the head of Indian Affairs at that time, suppressed the report. Bryce worked for Scott, and Bryce sent in his report as the medical officer. And what D.C. Scott said is, well, maybe we don't need a medical officer if he's going to give us reports that go against what we're trying to do. So he actually just simply dismissed him. It wouldn't be until 1922 that Bryce would publish his book called A National Crime. 1922. Okay, we kept residential schools going until 1996, but as early as 1907, we're having serious problems reported. As early as 1890, we had sexual and physical abuse reported in the schools. So it's not something that was hidden. It's not something that we didn't know about. It's something that had to be suppressed, information that had to be suppressed so that we could keep these schools going. And this is one of the most famous statements about the residential schools from 1920 by D.C. Scott, head of Indian Affairs, and he said this: "I want to get rid of the Indian problem." Okay, let's think about what that Indian problem is. "I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." That was the goal, right? That was the goal by the head of Indian Affairs. That was the way we talked. That was ultimately the end for having residential schools, was to completely assimilate these people. The best way to do that, make them lose their language, and then the customs and the other aspects of the culture will fall away. So quickly from 1907, just a bunch of aspects of the legal and political process that led to the dismantling of native culture. Forbidden to wear dress, as I already mentioned. The Indian Act was revised in 1927 because there was an attempt by the Nisga'a people in northern BC to hire lawyers to look into the Constitution to fight for their traditional native rights. And when the Nisga'a people tried to do this, the government created another law and said, if you are raising money to fight against the government, we will consider it treason. Okay? So they were not allowed to raise money to hire lawyers to fight for their constitutional rights. We did that legally, so-called legally, by passing a law in 1927. In 1940, residential schools were forced to follow provincial standards of education. Up until then, it had been very ad hoc. Different schools followed different curriculum and different policies. And so finally, only in 1940, well over 50 years from their inception, these schools are finally following provincial standards of curriculum. Residential schools begin to open in the north for the Inuit, okay, as the Canadian government's interest in the north increased. The Indian Act was overhauled in 51. where women were allowed to vote in banned elections. The Native people still can't in 1951. They don't, not until 1961, I believe. Not until 1961 did they get the right to vote, but women weren't allowed to vote in their own banned elections until 1951. Women in Canada didn't get the vote until the end of World War I, about 1918. 1958, the Indian Affairs Inspectors recommend closing. Okay, this is Indian Affairs now. These schools aren't working. They're being resisted by the Native people. They are causing diseases. There's abuse going on. And Indian Affairs themselves recommend closing the residential schools. But by 1960, there's still 10,000 students in these residential schools. In 1969, because of accumulating reports of abuse, etc., the government takes responsibility back from the churches. 1979, there's still 12 schools in operation. 1982, if you know a bit of your Canadian history, Trudeau went to Britain, and we actually got our own constitution. And we finally, at that time, recognized Indigenous people. We used to say there was 2 founding groups in Canada, right? The French and the British. And the new constitution said there was 3, included the Native people. 1986 to 94, we begin the process of apologizing, okay? So it takes us well over 100 years to kind of recognize the wrong that's been done. And it will still be another 20 years after this before we start the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I think I have one of those apologies here in a moment. From 1967, the Hawthorne Report. The government report on the status of First Nations people concluded approvingly, okay, 1967, that school integration represents the first step toward the dissolution of most reserves, because education makes it possible for Indians to adapt themselves to the white Canadians' way of life. In other words, in 1967, we were talking about dismantling the schools, but we were still very intent upon the idea of assimilation of Native people. Rather than cultural respect and multiculturalism and equality, it was very much a waiting process for Native people to become like white people. So we could have picked the Catholic or the Methodist or the United, but this is the Anglican Church of Canada. Their apology to Native people, which last year when we went to the Museum of Anthropology, they actually had printed all of these apologies alongside a lot of Native comments on them. So this is the one for the head of the Anglican Church in 1993 to the Native people. And it goes like this. To my brothers and sisters. I don't know if we should read the whole thing, but let's read parts of it. Together here and with you, I have listened as you have told your stories of the residential schools. I have heard the voices that have spoken and the pain and hurt experienced in the schools and of the scars which endure to this day. I have felt, this is a good way to apologize, by the way, to say that not only do you say, I'm sorry you feel this way. Have you ever heard people apologize that? I'm sorry you feel this way. Okay? You're not really sorry. And then there's usually a but after that. I'm sorry you feel this way, but this is how I feel. The proper way to apologize is to find out how the other person feels and feel it. Okay? And so I have felt the shame and humiliation as I have heard of the suffering inflicted by my people, and as I think of the part of our church played in that suffering. I am deeply conscious of the sacredness of the stories you have told, and I hold them in highest regard, etc. Okay, so it's maybe a little late, but it's better late than never. I would suggest that we began to acknowledge what was happening in residential schools. We conclude the 90s with a variety of prosecutions against teachers in residential schools. I don't know if you heard in the news, John what's his name, who ran the Olympics in Vancouver, was recently accused, I think it was a false accusation, but of being involved in abuse at a Catholic school quite recently. So anyway, the last residential school closes in 1996, and they start an Aboriginal Healing Fund. The government does. They pop $350 million into that. It's good. Okay, $350 million. But that's going to be a drop in the bucket compared to what they're eventually going to have to pay out when the lawsuits start. So you get a lot of collective action lawsuits against the government, and they're huge because they have not only the record of the abuse, it's kind of going alongside our current recognition of their historical rights. Both of these things are kind of coming to light at the same time. So things are changing a lot in our relationship with Native people in the current time. In 2000, when did he do it? 2008. Yeah, 2008. Harper makes an official government apology for Canada running these residential schools. Just before that, and I suppose it's good that this happened first, but there was the government settles a class action lawsuit for $2 billion. Okay, $2 billion that was paid out, and I can't remember, somewhere I was reading about what that meant per person, and it's not as big as it sounds, but still, that's the government attempting to redress some of the harm that it's done. I'd also say it's the government trying to get rid of the Indian problem still, right? Trying to get past it. And yet, I don't think we're past it because we are still talking about historical land rights that have not been settled. So, 2008, they announced the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That thing finally wraps up, actually just last year. And it was a process of going to various towns where there were residential schools or lots of survivors of residential schools, and talking about what happened in this place, just like they did in South Africa, where in South Africa it was slightly different. I mean, you had legal trials where if you told the truth and everyone was satisfied that the truth was told, you'd be granted amnesty, right? And we would forget about the past. In this, we told the truth. We tried to bring out the truth as much as possible, but we still haven't really forgotten. We haven't really reconciled. That's why I have a question mark on the reconciliation. Someone published a report